been a very nice long conversation. We're bosom buddies now.
I know, we've known each other for
Perfect. So I'll give everybody a second to get their seats.
Hello. Can everybody hear me? Hello. If everybody's ready, you can grab a seat, and I'll give you guys a little hello. First of all, thanks everyone for coming to Flyleaf and to this event. We're really excited to hear Marlie talk about her new book, or her recent book. And it's great to have you here, and attendance at events like these and buying our books is what lets us keep having them and honoring our authors, so we really appreciate you. This evening, we have the pleasure of hearing from Marlie Wasserman about her book, PATH of Peril. Marlie writes historical crime fiction after a career on the other side of the desk in publishing. In addition to PATH of Peril, she is the author of The Murderess Must Die and the forthcoming Inferno on 5th, coming out in 2024. She is a member of the Historical Novel Society and the Triangle chapter of Sisters in Crime, and reviews regularly for the Historical Novel Society Review. Marlie lives with her husband in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. We hope you enjoy. Thank you again. And remember, you can grab a copy of the book up front if you haven't already. Enjoy also our refreshments in the back.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming. I think this is this great show of support. And I particularly want to thank three groups of people. I want to thank those friends who have brought some wonderful food that I hope you have enjoyed. Catherine, Franca, Barbara, and Joan, thank you so much. I also want to thank my book club, the Greenbridge Book Club, because many of you have come out to support me. And last but not least, I want to thank the staff of Flyleaf. They made this event possible, and I think it's great for the community and for their store. Now, as I talk, I'm aware that I'm going to be talking to two different groups of people. Some of you have read my book, and in that case, for you, I'm going to try and give you some ideas of things that you may not have considered as you read it. But most of you probably have not read the book yet. And for you, I'm going to give you the usual cheesy one-sentence plot summary. Meek White House Secretary Maurice Lada accompanies President Theodore Roosevelt on his visit to the Panama Canal in 1906, where Lada witnesses multiple assassination attempts while learning about his own strengths and weaknesses. Now that sentence doesn't capture, thank goodness, all my many subplots and backstories. We'll get to those later, maybe in a Q&A session. But for those of you who have not read it, I think that if you sort of listen to some of the general issues that I'm going to raise, it will help guide your reading later on. So my plan for the next 30 or 40 minutes is simple. First, I'm going to talk about these three general issues, which either will help you understand what you've read or guide you as you read. Then I'm going to read three very short excerpts, and then we're going to have a Q&A session that I hope will be boisterous, or at least the questions should be boisterous. The answers might be sedate, but we'll do the best that we can. And please do not hesitate to just get up and grab food and wine while I talk. It's not going to disturb me in the least. Okay, so the first issue that I want to raise is the setting, Panama. Chances are very few of you have ever read a book on Panama before. So before I get into too much on Panama, I'd kind of like to see a show of hands. How many of you have actually been to Panama or gone down the Panama Canal? Oh, well, that's not bad. I think I count 5 or 6. So you'll just, those of you who have been there, just put up with a little bit of description. So I'm going to do a sort of 3rd grade math thing for you to begin with. And don't worry that you can't see what I'm going to be holding up, because I'm going to pass this stuff around later on. But obviously, North America, South America, Panama is this tiny little country in Central America. And the yellow, which some of you may be able to see, is the path that Teddy Roosevelt took when he left from a little place called Piney Point, Maryland. He was on the USS Louisiana, a big battleship, and it went to Puerto Rico for refueling, and then ended up in this tiny country. Now, here's a better version of that map, because you can see it a little more easily. So Panama, as I said, it's a tiny country, and it's shaped sort of like a lowercase n, or a hill. And this is where he landed, Colon, which is in the Caribbean. And then he took a train, because the canal wasn't finished yet. So the train paralleled the canal and went to Panama City, which is in this part of Panama, counterintuitively on the Pacific. So that's his route over 5 days, 4 or 5 days in 1906. And the train has a sort of major role in my story. And these are some pictures. Again, I'll pass them around. Here he is with his wife, Edith, on a fairly conventional train, but most of the time they were on an open air train exposed to the climate. And again, you can see they're both wearing white for the tropics. So that tells you something about the geography. But what I haven't explained is that Roosevelt wanted to go there to check on progress with the canal. The canal was really important to him. He believed in technology. He believed in naval power. He was very much sort of internationally focused, and he wanted to go there to check on it, and then to report back to Congress so that he could keep getting funding for the canal. So that was his intent. Beyond the geography, the other aspect of the setting that I want to emphasize is the climate. Those of you who have read the book know that it's constantly raining. There was record rainfall for the 5 days that he was there. And everyone is wet, everyone is soggy. Those clothes never dry. You know, they didn't have the kind of clothes we have now that dry. So everything was very uncomfortable during those 5 days. And I realized, as I was picking some excerpts that I'll read later on, that in every single excerpt I talk about people sweating. So yeah, that's just another aspect of the setting. And the final aspect of the setting is the one I'm least eager to talk about. I'm going to mention it, but I'm not going to belabor it. Panama was a really segregated society at that time. It hadn't been quite so bad before the Americans took over the canal zone. There was, you know, the usual discrimination, but it wasn't sort of codified the way it was once the Americans came. In 1903, the Americans sort of imported Jim Crow segregation onto Panama. So you have some cities that are known as silver cities, which means it's where all the workers from Barbados live. You have some cities known as the gold cities, which is where the engineers live. You have some dining halls for whites, some dining halls for blacks, and on and on. And that theme pervades a lot of what I've written. But again, I'm not going to belabor. We hear enough about this in the news. I'm not going to belabor it today. The second general issue is, why in the world did Marlie write a book on Panama? So I'm not from Panama. I did spend with Mark about a week there. But when I was in Panama, I didn't realize I kind of knew I would write about a book about Panama, but I hadn't thought through the plot or the characters yet. What happened is I was exercising on the treadmill one day at our home in New Jersey, and I was watching the History Channel. The episode that day was on Theodore Roosevelt's trip to the Panama Canal, and the narrator said, "This is the first time a sitting president has ever left the United States." And that sentence really captured my imagination, so much so that I did something I vowed to never do. Those of you, we have a few people from publishing in the audience, and you'll know what an epigraph is. It's that sort of corny opening to a book where people, you know, they put Plato in here, they put Shakespeare in here. I don't like it because it always seemed pompous to me, as though my book is going to somehow add, you know, more to Plato or to Shakespeare. But what did I do? I added an epigraph to this book because it was one that was just so wonderful I couldn't pass it up. And this is from a historian's book, David McCullough, who died recently, but he was a very well-known historian who wrote a book on Panama called The Path Between Seas. And the sentence is, the trip to Panama to see the canal was one of those small, luminous events that light up an era. And that was what I felt when I listened to this History Channel episode. So, as I said, it captured my attention. I began to study a little bit about presidential visits overseas. So some of you know Roosevelt, FDR, that Roosevelt. He went to Yalta at the end of World War II. That was actually a surprisingly dangerous trip because people were afraid of Japanese air attacks. And what wasn't known then and is barely known now is that there were squadrons of airplanes from the U.S. that protected him on his way there. So that's another example of a dangerous presidential trip. Some of you may remember that Nixon went to Caracas, Venezuela in 1958, and his car was rocked and stoned. There's a very frightening video of that on YouTube if you want to watch it. He wasn't president at the time, but he was about to be. And then you will all know some of the other presidential trips. JFK went to Berlin, made the famous "I am a Berliner" speech, and Reagan went also to Berlin and made the Mr. Gorbachev knock down this wall speech. So presidential trips have been in the news, but not all of them have had dangers associated with them, or I would argue, known dangers associated with them. So in my imagination, Teddy Roosevelt's trip to Panama did have dangers, and that's one of the things that I write about. The third general issue that I hope you'll keep in mind has to do with suspense. Some of you may remember a book by Frederick Forsyth called The Day of the Jackal. It was a wildly successful thriller about the jackal, a sort of semi-fictional character who was a paid assassin, paid to shoot Charles de Gaulle, who, by the way, died of an aneurysm, not of the assassin, from an assassin's bullet. There was a movie with Edward Fox playing the assassin, and they're going to make a remake of it with Eddie Redmayne playing the assassin. So when I read this book decades ago, what stayed with me was that even though I knew the jackal was not going to be successful in killing de Gaulle, I was still on the edge of my seat when I read it. There was a lot of tension involved for the whole 300 or 400 pages. And I even remember reading two of the reviews in the New York Times. One reviewer said, "The outcome hardly matters. The pieces have all clicked into place, and the fun of this hard-nosed story is watching how those pieces click." And another reviewer in the Times said, "The twists along the way, those were what sustained suspense. So I'm not going to claim that I write as well as Frederick Forsyth. I don't. But I was inspired by his book to imagine another story where the outcome is known and yet the tension is there throughout the book. Now, on to some of the excerpts. So I picked 3, and I'm going to explain to you why I picked these particular 3. One is that they sort of demonstrate the way I write, because I don't write a book from a single point of view. I'm always sort of mesmerized by different perspectives on a topic. So what I do is I change perspectives with each chapter. And that, writing experts will tell you not to do that. It's kind of dangerous, puts a lot of burden on your readers to change perspective along with you, but that is what I do. So each of the 3 are written from a different perspective. The other reason that I chose these 3 is that I only have to tell you the setting. I only have to set the stage for you once, because all 3 of these excerpts happen in the same place, at the same time. So now I'm going to set the stage, and this will work for all 3 excerpts. So you have to imagine that this room is not this wonderful room, but it's the central square, Central Plaza in Panama City, Panama. And behind me, anchoring this side, is the cathedral, Santa Maria. So it's not the most architecturally significant church, but it is the right scale for the plaza. There's this sort of Renaissance style central part, 2 white pillars, and so that's back here. In front of the cathedral is the speaker's platform, just like there's a podium here. And you have President Roosevelt speaking, you have President Manuel Amador, who's the president of Panama. Behind them and off to the side, you have the 2 first ladies, Maria Amador and Edith Roosevelt. And so they're all looking out at the crowd. Then you have the 3 other sides of this plaza. Again, you have to use your imagination, but if you've been to New Orleans, to the French Quarter, you probably have a good sense. You have these sort of colonial style buildings on 3 sides, the fancy wrought iron there, and there's another picture which I'll send around. In the plaza, you have a lot going on. You have parades, horseback riders, bands, singing students. I mean, it's a big ceremony. Roosevelt is here. And you have, you'll be able to see this more clearly later, you have people on the balcony looking down, and you're all the bystanders. Okay, so now, the first piece I'll read is from the point of view of Edith Roosevelt. So I told you she's the second wife of Teddy Roosevelt. She's our first lady, and then Maria Amador is the first lady of Panama. Another name that I'll read is Maurice Lotta. He's the Meek Assistant Secretary from the White House, who I mentioned before. And then there are a bunch of Secret Service agents, and their names, unfortunately, they're real historic figures, and so I had to use their actual names. Larry and Jimmy, they don't exactly resonate. But if you hear a name like Larry or Jimmy, it's going to be one of the Secret Service agents. Okay. Edith Roosevelt wondered if Maria Amador also suffered from the heat on the speaker's platform. Maria may have built up tolerance. The 2 women wore the full uniform of first ladies in the tropics. Layers of white linen covered every inch. Like Edith, Maria would be wearing a corset, would feel the sweat under her hat and veil. They sat 3 feet apart on the speaker's platform in front of the cathedral, looking out at TR's broad back, too broad, and at President Amador's narrow back and perfect posture. The heat and her husband's familiar patrician voice made Edith groggy. She had heard her husband's words many, many times, and with 6 children to worry about, she could focus on only so much. Perhaps Maria could concentrate more squarely on the occasion. Edith knew she ought to follow what she imagined was Maria's attentiveness, easier to drift off for a minute or two. She caught her eyes closing, pinched her arm as a signal to stay awake, to look out at the crowd. Tilting her chin up half an inch, she saw balconies filled with bystanders, men holding drinks in their hands, undoubtedly spirits. A sudden movement jolted Edith out of her brooding. She saw what others failed to see. A man barging up to Jimmy, Mr. Latta, that secretary who stuck by the rules, wouldn't share, pushing, pointing across the plaza. Oh my God, that gesture. Jimmy Sloan raised his head, pivoted, scurried to the other agents. Another false alarm? Don't stir. Trust Jimmy. Sit still. More movement. Agents shoving. No gunshot? False again? A minute, 2 minutes. Her eyes stared across the plaza. Now she saw it. Larry signaling to Jimmy. Dizzy, light. The taste of lunch rising to her mouth. The veil with its white dots provided privacy, allowing her to grimace and to work through her breathing without others noticing. She thought about grabbing for Maria, looking for comfort, sharing, her reserved triumph for now. She remained aloof, upright. No one in the crowd would see her terror. No one would read about it. Now, keep in mind that Edith was born in 1861, and it's now 1906. That means that she had lived through 3 assassinations of presidents, Lincoln, Garfield, and just 5 years earlier, McKinley. So it's not a great surprise that she would be anxious anytime her husband was out in public. Okay, now we are going to move to the assassins. So the guy I'm calling assassin number 1 is up there on the balcony with his rifle, looking out at the crowd, trying to figure out how to shoot TR. There's another assassin, I'm going to call him assassin number 2, and he's not up high, he's at ground level, he's one of you. And he's also thinking, how is he going to shoot Roosevelt? But the 2 assassins don't know about that the other one exists. So these are sort of separate incidents. So the guy up there, number 1, his name is Magnus Gustafsson, or that's the name that he has invented for himself, a Swedish name. He's actually Arthur Sitwell from England. So why did I give him this identity that's sort of either British or Swedish, depending on what name he uses? It's because a lot of this book is about anarchists. And anarchists sort of, they had a very bad name. You know, people were afraid of anarchists. They had gone on killing sprees, killing heads of state in Europe, and they were almost all Italians. And there was a lot of prejudice against anyone who looked Italian, who might be an anarchist. So I kind of purposely made this guy British or Swedish to get away from that stereotypical impression of anarchists. He had once tried to kill Roosevelt 3 years earlier and failed, so he was really determined. He came from Chicago, where he owned a hansom cab company, so he had taken the train from Chicago to New York, and then took a ship from New York to Panama. He pretended not only that he was Magnus Gustafsson, but that he was a professional photographer. So he had a big camera case, and that's what he used to hide his rifle in. The only other thing you need to know before I read this little passage is that there's a guy named Xing Wang, and Xing Wang is the accomplice. He's helping Gustafsson, assassin number 1, because he has grudges of his own. And in my mind, he kind of represents some of the small shopkeepers in Panama. When we meet Gustafson in this excerpt, he's standing on that second floor balcony in front of a room that he rented, and he's leaning against one of those beautiful balconies. He's looking at the platform. He had made meticulous preparations, but he hadn't quite realized how visible he was going to be in that position. People on adjacent balconies could see his balcony, as could people on the balconies on each of the plaza's sides at right angles to his side. Already men decked out in formal suits and women wearing wide-brimmed hats stood against the railings to view the plaza hours before the president's scheduled address. He noticed a man pouring what appeared to be whiskey and passing it around to smiling takers. Gustafson could not simply stand with his semi-automatic Winchester stabilized by the iron railing and aim across the square. He had planned for contingencies, throwing a black cloth in his camera case while still in New York awaiting passage. Newer camera equipment did not always require protection against light, but he doubted most Panama City residents would know that. They would think instead that it was routine for a photographer using a tripod to drape his head and shoulders and the back of a bulky camera with a black cloth. Today, inside the rented room, Gustafson experimented to determine if the cloth would hide both his head and the rifle. No matter what position he took, the 40-inch rifle stuck out in front of the drape. For a few horrid seconds, he knew he should abandon his post, run. Then he looked out at the festooned speaker's platform with the Roosevelt family crest attached to a drape, set up for the powerful, the men who grabbed. He took a breath, 2 breaths, rethought his plan. On the balcony, he would slowly and deliberately set up the tripod, camera, and cloth. Spectators on the surrounding balconies would see a professional hard at work with complex arrangements. Then, with a few minutes to spare, he would move the equipment inside with the French doors leading onto the balcony open 2 feet. He would be less visible. The rifle would be visible behind the open French doors, but only if spectators studied the inside of a dark room, rather than looking at the speaker's platform or the parading horseback riders and marching bands scheduled to start the festivities. Weeks before, Xing Wang had measured the plaza, laboring with his calculations at 2 in the morning, scrambling to avoid the light from lampposts. 503 feet from east to west, the dimension that mattered. He had telegraphed Gustafson the number. Armed with those details, Gustafson had selected his Winchester. Now, from 503 feet, Gustafson subtracted 8 feet because the speaker's platform stuck out a bit. He added 4 feet to allow for his position inside the room. He needed to shoot 499 feet, well within the Winchester's effective range of 200 yards or 600 feet. Gustafson could put the rifle under the drape and add to it the telescopic sight, a new invention he had imported to Chicago from Austria and then added to his luggage. He tried to ignore the sweat still dripping onto his white collar, vowed to succeed, and waited. Okay, so that's our frustrated assassin number 1 up there. And then our final assassin, the one who's on the ground level, he is Italian, and his name is Agresti, Alberto Agresti. So we're in the same plaza, a different assassin. He's also a meticulous planner. When we meet him, he had already cased the joint, and he had identified an area near a bench that would allow him a good view of Roosevelt. So now he needs to find a very specific spot to stand. And after a few minutes, he's going to notice the same agents, Larry and Jimmy, that Edith sees. And these agents catch and disarm Gustafson up there in his room behind the balcony, some of which Agresti sees. One phrase you'll hear me say is great engineering feat of our time. And that's a phrase from the speech that Roosevelt is reading, and that kind of resonates in different places throughout the book. So the final story here. Alberto Agresti. By 2:30, Agresti reached the plaza. He returned to the area of the bench. As he had hoped, groups of men and women stood shoulder to shoulder. He studied the women. One looked taller and wider than the others, with a full skirt, gathered sleeves, and an elaborate hat. He staked out a position a foot behind her, hoping his proximity simply echoed the other close encounters in the plaza. He tried to ignore her pungent perfume, the mole near her hairline, the perspiration shining on the back of her neck. In the space between the feathered hat and the full sleeve, Agresti had an acceptable view. Adjusting his head, he spotted near the platform a tall man, round-cheeked, another one brawny, another beefy, each glancing into the crowd, each unaccompanied by a woman. With luck, those agents would not see a rising hand behind a wide-brimmed hat. He would shoot, drop the revolver, run. Seeming to check the balconies for familiar faces, he turned around frequently, craning his neck to study possible escape paths. All appeared encumbered, but some led to streets, while others led to dead ends. A surge of noise and movement on the dais as the ceremonies began. Agresti rotated his shoulders, shook out his arms, tried to ignore the sweat dripping down under his straw hat. First Amador, looking old, standing straight, now Roosevelt, younger, heavier, the crowd clapping, yelling support in two languages. Agresti felt himself breathing too rapidly on the wide lady's neck. He tried to slow his breathing, reminding himself that he would need to do so when he aimed. He hoped the woman couldn't smell him. He could smell her. At last he heard, "Great engineering feat of our times." He feared TR was winding down. Only a few seconds to act. The crowd looked forward. He gripped the revolver in his pocket, fingered the trigger. He turned around to take a final look at his escape path, all his senses on alert. On the high balcony, maybe scuffling inside the French doors, the men he had hired earlier, or was he a nervous coward, imagining a snag, allowing a distraction? Seconds passed. The president nodded goodbyes. Then the brawny man came out on the balcony, making a slight gesture of success. The crowd drifted out of the plaza. Agresti let himself be carried along. At 4:30, he was alive as a coward, codardo. Why didn't he aim sooner? He missed his best chance. Now he had just one more. So you hear the different perspectives, all in the same plaza, and they all failed. But this is only the middle of the book, so you're going to have to agree to see if those guys get a second chance. Now, I haven't read you any excerpts that relate to the many other people in this book, and if you've had a glance at the cast of characters, you know there are many. So you'll have to read to figure out the stories of the men and women who came from Barbados and Jamaica, to dig the canal, from the women we call ladies of the night, from the doctors, the nurses, the journalists, but you'll find all those groups in the book. Now, I hope that you have a lot of questions for me. And if not, I'll ask myself some.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good question. So when you start the writing process, you have a lot of different real events that have happened. That's tricky. So how do you sort of go into characters first, or do you sort of map out the plot first, and then where does the history fit in? And how do you have to, in terms of accuracy of the history, is that important? Or when you're writing fiction, can you just...
Yeah. So the way I like to think of it is that there's a historical record, and I always want to be true to whatever is known. So that's sort of the spine of the book. So I do a lot of research, and at this point it's mainly about plot, because I want to know who is where when, what is actually happening, what's been reported in the papers of record. But as you can imagine, especially in 1906, I don't know enough about anatomy to make this accurate, but although you have the spine, you have a lot of muscle and tissue and blood and stuff around the spine, and that's what's not always known. So if something is known, I'm not going to change it. That's why I have the silly names of Jimmy and Larry as the two agents, and I could give you many other examples. But we know almost nothing about motivations. And so then after I have the sort of skeleton down, that's when I start thinking, well, who were these characters? What were they thinking? What were they doing? And I think in this book about half of my characters are historical, and then I fill in the other half with imagined characters. But I always try to be honest to the feel of the time. So even if I'm imagining a character, I don't want to have someone doing something or thinking something totally ahistorical, you know, out of the. Does that answer your question? And yes.
To build off that a little bit, so, sorry about that.
Yeah, that's okay.
In terms of the historical characters in the book, were you able to dig into letters, archives, that sort of thing that demonstrated what they were thinking, what they were doing, what they were experiencing, and able to translate that through the book?
Yeah. So a little bit for the officials. So that, you know, I've read some of the letters, some of Roosevelt's letters, and there are many officials connected to the Canal Zone. And they wrote up and back to Washington for money and for other things. So I know that. What I wasn't able to do at all was to get first-person accounts from the 19,000 Barbadians who came to the Panama Canal to dig the canal. They left no record. Now they did, they often stayed in Panama. Some returned to Barbados, some stayed in Panama, and they often told stories to their families. And at the very end of the book, I make reference to a contest that the Panama Canal had in about 1960, where often grandchildren wrote back, they wrote essays and told the stories that their grandfathers or grandmothers had relayed about the canal. So I was able to pull some of that up, but I would say that to make this real simple, the poorer the character, the more I had to invent.
Got it.
The richer, more established the character, the more there was a record that I could rely on. Yes, Virginia.
There are a whole lot of people in this book, and as a writer and your writing process, how do you keep them all straight?
So that's a common question, of course, that people ask me. I couldn't help myself. I mean, I was fascinated with Panama as a place that pulled people from all over, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes because they were hiding from something. As I indicated, some were poor, some were rich, some had jobs, some didn't. And I didn't want to leave any category out. So it becomes quite easy, I think, for the writer to keep track. Because what happens, and a lot of writers will tell you that the people kind of take over your body, you know. You're thinking about them all the time. They become real to you. And so I didn't have the same problem that readers might have in trying to keep them straight. I did two things to try and help readers. One is the cast of characters at the beginning, which is pretty good if you have a paper copy of the book, and not so good for those of you who have Kindle copies. But the other thing I tried to do was to reintroduce a character. You know, if you haven't met Joe Schmo for 200 pages, I do try and remind you who Joe Schmo is. But I'm going to tell you that I vow on the next book I'm writing, 10 is the max. I'm not going to allow myself to do this again. Yes.
There were groups of people who were opposed to the canal being built at all. Do they factor into your story?
No, they don't. But you're absolutely right. There was a lot of politicking going on before. There were people who didn't want the canal at all. They just thought it was a waste of money. There were politicians arguing against it. Even more importantly, there were a lot of people campaigning to have the canal go through Nicaragua, not through Panama. For a while, the chief engineers supported the Nicaraguan route, and eventually they supported the Panama route. But for me to have put that into the book would have made it even longer and even more complex. And I had some of it in, and then I cut it out, because historical novelists are always warned against what is called an info dump. You know, you do all your research, you get all this great information, and then you kind of wedge it in somewhere, and many of your readers are going to skip over it. So, but you're right, and I wish I could have added more. But next one. Yes. Wow.
By 1906, is yellow fever still happening?
That's a good question. When I started writing, I assumed it was. And I assumed a lot of my book would be about that. Well, for the good of the public, I will tell you it was eradicated, I would say, around a year before was the last case, 1905. And there's lots of good stories about how they got rid of it. It was really very ingenious. They hired hundreds of workers to fumigate and to drain swamps. They identified which kind of mosquito caused yellow fever. They couldn't get rid of malaria, but they did get rid of yellow fever. But as we know with COVID, you can't turn the spigot on and off. You know, it's not that one day you have a disease or an illness and the next day you don't. People are still today kind of, you know, cautious more than they would have been before. And in Panama, there had been such fear from yellow fever, it's a really awful disease, awful death, that there was still this lingering, you know, do I really want to be in Panama? And right around the time, right around 1906 is when some of the men who were there felt comfortable having their wives or sweethearts come over and be with them. So there was no yellow fever, but there was still the unease that had come with yellow fever.
Did you have a favorite character that as you were writing the book, you're like, oh, I'm glad I get to write about this person now, and if so, why?
Yeah. So as you might have guessed from my selections, Edith Roosevelt was my favorite character, and I had thought in the beginning that I might write this book entirely from her perspective. I didn't do that, but it relates to what I was saying earlier, that this woman had lived through 3 presidential assassinations. I mean, I've only lived through Kennedy, and that still haunts me. And to live through 3 and then accompany your president to a place where there are supposedly anarchists on the run. I'd read a biography of Edith Roosevelt, and she was just a really interesting person in her own right. She was somewhat sedate, what's the word I want to use, introspective, but very well educated, and just a wonderful first lady in her own right. I also had 2 characters I didn't like, and you know, novelists are told to never have characters that are either all good or all bad. But I have 2 people, minor characters in there, who I think I didn't follow the advice because they're pretty purely evil. One is John Connell, and the other is Edgar Winston. They're both sort of minor officials, and they're no good mix, you know. But 2 out of, you know, many. Yes.
What was the Secret Service like back then?
So the Secret Service was in its infancy. One of the reasons that McKinley was probably assassinated in 1901 was that he didn't exactly have a good detail. You know, there were a couple of people, a couple of detectives assigned to him, but nothing very thorough, nothing very formal, not great training. And there was, I forget the exact dates now, but there was some legislative activity to fund the Secret Service right after McKinley died. And so with Roosevelt, it was better. But Roosevelt, those of you who read the book may remember some brief references I made to Roosevelt not really wanting Secret Service agents to protect him. You know, this was the guy who thought he was a Rough Rider and, you know, killed buffalo and, you know, a man's man, whatever that means. And he really didn't think he needed that Secret Service protection. So the agents, there were three, Jimmy and Larry, and there was also a Frank. And they were pretty dedicated. I found what little research I could on them, and they were good guys, very loyal, very determined to protect him. So although I made up a lot of their activities, what I made up was pretty consistent with what I could find out about. Anyone else? Kate?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned living through Kennedy's assassination. And I'm curious what it was like to go through the process of writing the assassination attempts, and whether you dreamed about it, whether you, how you felt about sort of trying to get into the minds of these assassins.
Yeah. So what I do know, let me first talk about the historical record for a second. What I do know is that the Secret Service and various people in Washington did sense threats against Roosevelt's life. And so they sent all sorts of people to check the ships, the manifests of ships coming into the harbor. So the likelihood of assassination attempts is accurate. Now, one of my favorite blurbs or endorsements says that I did get into the heads of these assassins. Whether I did or not is for my readers to judge. But in changing perspectives throughout the book, the burden was on me to actually try to think this through. And what I use in each of those sections is what's called a third-person limited perspective. That's what writing instructors would call it. Third person, because it's all, you know, he or she, but limited because I try and write from the perspective of only what that person knows, not what that person thinks, you know, someone else thinks, but very limited, just as each of you have your own limited perspectives. So I just tried real hard, you know, and I read a lot about anarchists. I read a lot about Patterson, where some of them live. I read a lot about Chicago, my hometown, where some of them live. And I did my best to make them human, to give them motivations, not to justify their what they were doing, but I think, you know, we can all understand how people might think that people in power are too powerful and not doing the people's business. So I tried, and I had a lot of fun doing that.
Nice. So it didn't keep you up at night?
The plot kept me up at night in general, you know, trying to fit all the pieces together and make sure that they were logical.
Thank you.
Thank you. Quick question. Do you have a favorite place to write?
Yes, but
Is it top secret?
No, it's just that we live in a small condominium, and you know, there's one place, one desk, and that's really,
No
that's
coffee
it.
shops.
No coffee shops, no beaches. No, I want to be at one little place. Yeah.
Going along with that, do you write in longhand? Do you do it on the computer? Do you dictate? A little bit of everything?
I always write on a laptop, on my little desk in a little room. I've been very surprised, though, when I read about other writers, that some writers, and I'm not going to remember their names now, but some famous writers who you have heard about, write in longhand on yellow pads.
I think Stephen King at least used to.
Yes.
Yeah.
And people say that, you know, the muscular action helps their brain. Now, related to your question, though, what I have done, this is new for me, is in proofreading. I'm sure you've all experienced trying to read your own words and not seeing an error. But Microsoft Word has a feature that's called Read Aloud. So when I have my draft done and I've gone through it, and I know I've corrected what I can, and I know I've missed a lot, I press that Read Aloud function, and a lovely woman's voice reads my book back to me, and if I'm missing a word, I catch it. And if I have a word twice, I catch it. So it's a, you know, that's the one sort of technological advance that I've learned to use. Any other questions? Oh, you know what? I forgot to circulate the pictures. So if anyone wants to actually see them, I think I'm going to leave them here for a few minutes. And feel free to come up and look at the church and the square. But thank you very much for coming.
Website. I believe it. Yeah. Thanks for coming today.
Oh, you bet.
Start reading today.
I'm a family. I'll send it. Okay. Good to see you.
Oh, I think I were playing no way in the world. How much look at the book in process? Almost you know, I was sitting on my fantastic. Start my high school because
so Pangea breaks out and all the kind of slowly. And ocean currents and tides are at some point South and we start having ice ages and really bad. So if you want to go back
Yeah, I think I've talked to so many authors who just
so then you not made. It's a pretty old canal. Maybe at one point super big. don't think there's enough. I don't think there's enough to get temperature. Canals like doing this, like you go from but I think it's the water used to so
I used to very as a reminder of what
I say. Yeah, we've never had that. Yeah, that's the nothing else.
Just checking around.
Yes, I haven't seen it yet, but my nephew saw it. So I, of course, I have to see it. So it is a computer
Obviously, I would never say that. You rubbed off on it?
More likely the other way around. Thanks for coming.
There's a lot more than
I'm readjusting.
Any pathways cleared or anything?
Moving around where it's a little easier to get around there.
Okay, great.
We're being accurate. There is no Mario in the world. There's no back. Yes. Probably couldn't get it back.
I'm not spending more money on it. So I was like, you gotta make choices. But it was one of those Oreos. I'm wondering what was happening.
Drinks are like
idea.
well, I don't know where. That may be a fine.
Or whatever, maybe dinner.
Are we going to out?
Yeah. We are.
Where's your whip?
It's my next time.
I'll see you guys later.
Mark, thanks for coming. Great. It was great. Like, Mark, really quick, your camera on. Mark did a lot.